So today we'll be talking about Chapter 2, Section 2. And we're learning about pyramids on the Nile River. And I just like to start with this picture because even though, yes, there are larger buildings today. Yes, the Sears Tower is still one of the tallest skyscrapers in the world in Chicago, Illinois, is taller than the pyramids. But they didn't have to build these things without computers. You know, think of the pyramids, think of the technology available to them at the time, then think about how incredible that is. As we get into Egypt, just a little, I want to give you a little background. The Nile River is Egypt. Egypt is the Nile River. Surrounding Egypt and the Nile River Delta is largely desert. It's dry, it's arid, there's little to no rainfall, it's inhospitable. But then when you get to Egypt, and I'll show you pictures of the Nile, it's this beautiful, lush, fertile river valley that can support a rather large population. Because speaking of river valleys, the world's most populated city is in Egypt today. So yes, it can still support large populations. The Nile River is 4,100 miles long. That's a really daggone long river. And it's kind of amazing in a lot of ways. For one, it floods every year. They don't get as much rainfall as we do. It's kind of ridiculous how much rainfall we've gotten lately. But it floods rather predictably every year. And all of this flooding is going to do something. Number one, it's going to wash dirt off of the mountains, causing erosion, kind of like what's happening to my backyard right now. It's going to wash all that mud down and off the mountain I live on and into the French Broad. And I don't know if you've ever been to Knoxville, Tennessee, but when you go west on the French Broad, that river is a mile wide in places. A mile wide. It's a big river by the time it gets to its terminus in meeting up with the Holston. And by the time it gets to the Mississippi, it's huge. And yes, there are farms built all along the French Broad River Valley. Just like if you go to Egypt, there are farms built all along the Nile River Valley. And those floods wash sediment out of the mountains, which are rich, nutrient-rich soil, down into the river valleys. It was so important to the Egyptians, they worshipped this river. They saw it as a god. It was their literal bread and butter. They would not have been able to live there. They would have died without that river. And so they saw it as their god. Now there's a sun god in Egypt. I'm sure you've heard of Ra. But there's also a god of the Nile. This is the Nile River Delta. So where the Nile starts, which gets confusing, it's called Upper Egypt. So it's actually the southern part of Egypt, where it comes out of the mountains in a series of rapids. What we're looking at here is what's called Lower Egypt, or near where the Nile River dumps into the Mediterranean. And by this point, it's fanned out. It's a very wide river. Just like here in Henderson County, the French Broad is rather narrow. You can swim across it in places. You know, in fact, where it starts in Transylvania County, you can hop across the French Broad. Go up to Courthouse Creek. That's the uppermost part of the French Broad. You can jump from one side to the other. And then imagine that by the time the river reaches its end at the Holston near Knoxville, it's a mile wide. It's the same principle with the Nile River. So the Nile River, by the time it reaches the ocean, is very, very wide, and it fans out just like this.
Because of the richness of the soil, Egypt was a farming society and exported its surplus around the Mediterranean. Grain, wheat, and barley, flax, papyrus, and linen.
And imported gold from Nubia, turquoise from Sinai, wood and perfumed oils from Lebanon, wood from Crete, copper from Cyprus, and wine from the Greek islands. The pharaoh, or ruler, who was in the early dynasties a god too, then became son of God as well as king and high priest. He was also believed to be responsible for the watering of the fields and the ebb and flow of the Nile. Pharaoh ruled the two kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolized by the double crown. The red crown of Lower Egypt was protected by the cobra goddess, and the white crown of Upper Egypt by the vulture goddess. Pharaoh, as the absolute power in Egypt, had himself portrayed in art as bigger than life, towering over other mortals.
Didn't the female carry the royal genes in her blood?
Some scholars say yes, and some say no. The records seem to favor the matrilinear theory, that descent was traced through the female. Also, brothers and sisters married each other frequently. Cleopatra is our best-known example. She married her brother Ptolemy.
Beneath court society, there was a class of artisans, clerks, and skilled workers who designed, administered, and built the palaces and monuments and made the material necessities of a civilized life.
And on the bottom of the social scale, peasants worked the land, as they still do today, 5,000 years later. There were a few slaves as well, who were either prisoners of war or their descendants.
The wealthy led a life of luxury, living in villas with gardens and large reception rooms.
They had ample water for bathrooms and toilet facilities. These granaries formed part of what was essentially an agricultural estate. The interiors of their palaces were decorated with beautiful murals.
What about the peasants?
As long as the Nile rose and fell as expected, and there was internal peace in Egypt, life was relatively decent for the peasants. Although they worked all their lives, few went hungry. During holidays, which often lasted for days, they retreated to food and drink at public expense. Numerous festivals throughout the year honored various gods and goddesses. All Egyptian life revolved around placating the gods, and their temples are still an architectural marvel.
Statues of Egyptian gods and goddesses can still be seen today, thanks to archaeologists. Some of the more familiar ones are Re, the great sun god, who with his wife Mut and son Hans were the most important.
Hathor, symbolized by the cow's horns, was one of the oldest deities, and later became known as the goddess of love.
Osiris ruled the land of the dead, after having been brought back to life by Isis, his sister and wife, who then miraculously conceived their son Horus.
Though the Egyptians had the gift of the Nile, there are still environmental challenges. Those yearly floods sometimes didn't happen. Guess what? Most of the gods of the ancient world were fickle, because most of the gods of the ancient world were based on elements, and elements are not entirely predictable. Right now we have crazy amounts of rain. There's nowhere that promises that a month from now we might not be in a crazy drought. In fact, this time 3 years ago, we were in a crazy drought. And if you can remember it, there were forest fires everywhere because there was no rainfall. Here we are 3 years later, and we're getting dumped on. It's just unpredictable. That's weather, right? That's life. Well, again, if you think of weather as a god, you would think of it as a very temperamental one. One that can get angry, one that can do bad things. Yeah, almost like Loki. You know, if Loki were a god of weather, that would be it. And but you know, sometimes they dump the rain on, like what we're dealing with now. You know, heavy floods could sometimes, and remember, while many of the rivers today in our geography are controlled by dams, In fact, the French Broad is one of the few that is not controlled by a dam. Right nearby us, we've got the Green River. Well, guess what? All of this flooding, the French Broad, this washing stuff away, and that's, the field when I'm driving home. I always like to look at the cows as I'm driving by, because whoever has that field just leaves the cows out there. And the cows are literally having to search for higher land because that field is a lake right now. Well, that's not the problem on the Green River. Because on the Green River, over in Tuxedo, they don't have the flooding. Because there's a dam there that can control that and account for it. Now, these heavy floods can destroy property, and even in some ways can be protective or isolating for the Egyptians. Okay, so Jonathan, like I said, Egypt is divided into an upper and a lower, and if you'll close that, please. What's that? The textbook? Yeah, still, if you'll close it, please. Yeah, thank you, sir. So Egypt's divided into two parts. There's an upper, there's a lower. And the upper part, think of like upper as in a river, is coming out of the mountains. Just like the French Broad. If you go to the upper reaches of the French Broad, it's steep and it's mountainous. It's around what's called Balsam Grove, North Carolina. And it's very, very steep. Waterfalls and rapids as it tumbles out of the mountains. And then when you get to the lower part of the French Broad, you can inner tube on it. I mean, it's flat, it's calm, it's peaceful. And then again, as you get to the lower reaches, what's called the mouth of a river, the mouth of the Nile, it fans out. Let's zoom in and look. This is called Lower Egypt, the mouth or the delta of the river. It kind of looks like a hand where it's just fanned out into different places. And then you've got Upper Egypt here, and what was then called Nubia. And these are the first rapids. Okay, so the first peoples in Egypt. Well, the earliest peoples date back, these folks have been here about as long as the Sumerians, some of these ancient river civilizations. But the oldest advanced civilizations began to unite. And they began to unite around kings. The first named king that we know of is someone named Narmer. I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation. Narmer was the first to unite the little river city-states around Egypt into one civilization. And he made as his capital Memphis. In fact, if you go visit Egypt, most of the big structures that we'll be talking about, the famous Palace of the Kings, the famous City of the Dead, the Great Pyramids of Giza, the Sphinx, and the Temple to the Pharaohs, all of those things are around Memphis, the capital of the first Egyptian dynasty. Speaking of these pharaohs, they were seen as gods. This is what we call a theocracy, meaning that the political leader of this civilization was also the religious leader, so known as god kings. So they were in control of the religion. They claimed to speak on behalf of the gods. They were in control of the government, political affairs, judgment, making laws, ruling. And they also governed the army. There were stories of pharaohs personally leading armies, in such as the Battle of Kadesh, or in the story of Exodus, where the pharaoh actually personally led the army that chased after the Israelites. And again, this is called a theocracy, where the government and the religion are one and the same. Now, the pyramids. There are some mysteries surrounding the construction of the pyramids and some crazy conspiracy theories. But for now, what I want you to understand is a little about Egyptian mythology. It is believed that every Egyptian person has a soul. It's called... So the soul in Egyptian mythology is called the Ka. And Ka is that life force. That's who we are. That's your personality. It's whatever you want to call it. It's that primal element that makes you you. And the Egyptians believed that that element, your personality, endures after you die. So whereas the secular person would say your personality is comprised of neurons firing within your brain, the Egyptian mythology would teach that your personhood endures after your death. And now, it was believed that the pharaohs would continue to rule after their death, that they would awake, that the Ka would awake, and that the body which housed their spirit would need to be preserved, because someday they would awake and they would need their body to continue to rule. And so because of this belief system, the pyramids were built as an elaborate and sophisticated means of preserving the body. You see, the ancient pyramids were so well constructed that the tombs within the middle of these pyramids were airtight. And thousands of years later, when these tombs were exhumed, when they were explored for the first time, there were reports of archaeologists becoming sick and even in some cases dying due to exposure to this stale air. But within the tomb, once the air would clear and the people would finally go in and it was safe to go in, the sarcophagus was also sealed airtight. And when they pulled open the sarcophagus and they found these mummies,
is that why people believe like the kings were cursed and like when someone entered?
And so I've got an interactive here that I want to show you. This is the inside of King Tut's tomb. Again, we know what it looks like because we found it preserved. It had not been disturbed. It had not been robbed. These are the things we found in there. So first off, the sarcophagus. This contained the body of King Tut. Notice it had several layers. Notice it had intricate carvings. These are angels or seraphs kind of guarding over the tomb. But there's more to see here. These are hieroglyphs of ancient drawings of, the monkeys on the wall may symbolize the moon god. We don't know exactly for sure. But you see these boats. Of course, the Nile River is just central to the culture of the Egyptians. You also, if you look on the right wall here, are going to see hieroglyphics detailing the story of the king's life. And, in fact, these hieroglyphs are telling the story of how his soul is going to re-enter his body in the afterlife. I mean, they believe that to be like a physical re-entry, which again explains the importance of preserving these artifacts and preserving his organs. So I don't know if you've seen movies about the mummification process. I just always thought it was neat. But they would stick these forceps through the nose into the brain, and they would remove the brain through the nose. They would remove the other vital organs, all the guts, the heart, etc., and they would each be placed in separate boxes. Well, that's because the Pharaoh's going to need them when he wakes back up. That's also because they knew so much about preservation that if they had just left all those guts in there, then they would have rotted. They were able to preserve the outside of the body, and then the inside, again, had to be kept in separate compartments. Let's see what else is worth seeing here.
It was all done wearing a mask.
I'm sorry?
The people doing it had to wear a mask. I don't know, it was a jackal kind of mask, that one in the corner.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Like that had a religious significance. These people performing these rituals of preparing him were even seen as kind of arbiters, like guiding these folks on the way to the afterlife. But lastly, just kind of on a personal note, in their religion, it was believed that Ra was the sun god, who traveled in a boat, and that the sun was carried on a boat, because again, water is just central to their culture, and that each day he would be born again. And so because of this, the boat was an important symbol in a.
Fortunately for our understanding of their culture, the Egyptians thought of the afterlife as an extension of life on earth, and filled their tombs with all the furniture, food, clothes, and jewelry they'd need to make life in the hereafter as pleasant as life on earth, with models of servants to help them. At first, pharaohs built monuments called mastabas to hold these tombs, and later they took the shape of a pyramid. We have all heard strange and mysterious tales about the mystic qualities of the shape, and some practical ones as well.
I like the one about putting a used razor blade under a pyramid shape and finding it sharp the next morning.
Is that true?
Try it and see for yourself.
I will.
Each pharaoh supervised the building of his own pyramid. In the off-season, when the Nile flooded the land, the peasants would be rounded up to work on the pyramids and other state projects, and they were paid in food and supplies for this labor.
And there's evidence that women also worked and were paid the same wages as men.
Inside the tombs, the walls were filled with scene after scene of men and women feasting, enjoying music, dancing, and hunting. The Egyptians loved life, so much so that they wanted to carry it across the threshold of death. They eventually tried to preserve the body to ensure that it would survive to enjoy the afterlife.
To do this, they first removed the insides, except for the heart, preserving them in 4 canopic jars. Baboon for the lungs, jackal for the stomach, falcon for the intestines, and the human held the liver. The body was then covered in natron crystals, which dried it.
The cavity of the body was filled with herbs to keep it from disintegrating. It was then rubbed with sweet oils and resins and tightly bandaged. This last done by priests, for the preparation of the dead for the afterlife was holy work.
The body was laid within as many as 4 coffins, one inside the other, all exquisitely decorated. The whole process took 70 days. The Egyptians even mummified animals.
"5,000 years later, the glitter's gone."
They painted their faces on the outside of their coffins, the same way that they made up when they were alive. Both men and women ringed their eyes with green or black liner, drawn into lines at the corner. Green eyeshadow was made from malachite, a green copper ore, which also protected their eyes from the glare of the sun and from common eye infections.
The first sunglasses.
Women dyed their lips and cheeks with red ochre, and palms and fingernails were reddened with henna.
All body hair was removed by creams, razors, and pumice stones. The wealthy often wore wigs made of human hair, bought from the poor.
Speaking of Egyptian culture, their religion is obviously central to their life. But the sun god and the goddess of the Nile were just one of many. In fact, there were around 2,000 different gods and goddesses. Some of the most important ones worth mentioning: Ra, of course, the god of the sun; because without the sun, you don't have crops. Without crops, you die. There's the goddess of death, or the god of death, Osiris. Because again, death is one of life's great final mysteries. Because does the soul transcend the body? Science would say the lights turn off, but there's still enough mystery there because no one's ever had the lights fully turn off and then turn back on again. Plenty of people have had their heart stop, but when brain death occurs, you just don't come back from that. Your heart stops and then shortly after your brain stops. So plenty of people have had their heart turned back on, but no one's ever had their brain turned back on. That's the stuff of science fiction. That's the stuff of mystery. That's the stuff of religion. And so, yes, the god of death is worshipped. And there's also a goddess considered the ideal woman, Isis. Okay, so the belief of life after death. Pharaohs obviously got to come back and rule again in their belief structure. But ordinary people also got to experience life after death. And they would be judged according to their deeds in life. You live a good life, you get a good afterlife. You live a bad life, bad afterlife. And pharaohs were not the only ones that got to be mummies. It was an expensive ritual. So if you were wealthy enough, you got to be preserved. So yes, we found lots of mummies. Still expensive enough that not everybody got to be a mummy, but anyway. There were exact procedures, and you can Google them, like, how do you make a mummy? There's a process. And it was all written down in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which contained the rituals that must be performed, but also the spells and the prayers, the things that had to be said. Not just anybody got to be a mummy maker. Like Jonathan said, these are very specific. It's a very specific cast of people. This would be one of the Egyptian gods, and this symbolizes the fact that Pharaoh, again, has this special communication with the gods. And guess what? If Samantha were to come to us and say, hey, God spoke to me, and he said we got to do this, this, and this, and this, and if you believed her, well, I guess you better do that, that, and that. That would give her an awful lot of power if we believed her. Well, the thing is, they believed the Pharaoh when he said, God spoke to me and said, you got to do this, this, and this. Of course, that's what the hieroglyphs suggest. So, this may be disturbing to some. Here's what a mummy looks like without the wrapping. Yes, it's a dead guy, but don't feel too bad for him. He's been dead for about 3,000 years. Not bad for a 3,000-year-old person, right? Not bad for a 3,000-year-old guy, right? We can actually see his facial features. You can actually see that he's kind of good looking. Like he's the Pharaoh. He would have been considered like the ideal person of his time. I think it's crazy you can even see the ears. Just that little piece of cartilage right there. You would think that's the first thing to fall off, but nope. You can see his hands.
I don't see one yet.
Yeah, the other one might not have made the journey. I don't know. It was a long time. Okay, so classes within. The pyramid. The river is central to their culture. The pyramid is also central to their culture. In fact, their very society is structured like a pyramid. At the top, you have the Pharaoh. He rules supreme. He has the power over life and death. Again, the boss. Below him, he has advisors. Yes, even god kings need advisors. They're called satraps or scribes or various bureaucrats that often did much of the job of ruling on their behalf. Most people fit into a few different classes. There are business people, there are farmers, and yes, there are slaves. This is one of the great mysteries, like who actually built the pyramids? Okay, Pharaoh ordered it, that's great, but who actually built it? Probably slaves, lots of them. Since these giant blocks the size of the classroom were moved by hand, that's going to take quite a few people. Okay, yeah, you can put some sticks under it to help the blocks move along, but they were quarried many miles away from their locations. And so, yes, it was through a brutal regime that these pyramids were built. But I think one redeeming quality, yes, they're slaves, yes, they're brutal masters, okay. But they're one of the few societies in the ancient world where women were equal to men. There are pharaohs like Narman, and there are female pharaohs. Yeah, like Hatshepsut was a female pharaoh. And honestly, her career was about as successful as any of the male pharaohs. Egyptian writing. The Egyptians were some of the first to develop systems of writing. To be fair, I think the Sumerians had them beat by a little bit, but not by long. The Egyptians do have the distinction of inventing the first paper. It's called papyrus. You are looking at a several thousands-year-old piece of paper. Probably one of the oldest pieces of paper in existence. And on it has writing. Now, their form of writing, and you're looking at, some of their script here. On the tomb, we saw lots of hieroglyphs, that is drawings that tell a story. But you also see that these pictures represent ideas. Now, this paper, it's not like the paper made over in Canton. It's not just ground up, chopped up trees. It's actually made from reeds, from a specific type of plant called a papyrus that has these very long leaves that can be dried and put together and stretched out. So I wanted to zoom in and show you some of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. Now also, I have to admit, I don't read Egyptian. Sorry, you don't have the noted Egyptian scholar. You just get me. So we can guess at what these things mean.
Looks like a bird.
Good. Yeah, looks like a bird. We've got some kind of beetle thing here. Again, I have to guess. But I think the neat thing about this is even though we don't read ancient Egyptian, maybe you do, maybe I just, okay, I don't. I can interpret what some of these things mean just by looking at them. You've got a wheel here, so that means they had some understanding of what a wheel is. We know that also because they had chariots. Speaking of wheels, what types of technology did they have? Well, we know they had an understanding of basic astronomy because they had a calendar based on 365 days. Not bad for 3,000 years ago, right? That means they had an understanding, and they probably hadn't pieced it all together, though one of the famous early astronomers named Ptolemy was Egyptian. But their early calendar was based on 365 days and 12 months. And then finally, they have a system of writing, which we've discussed, but also just the architectural marvels of the pyramids, of the giant statues. Just the fact that they built these things is rather remarkable. And then their medicine. The doctors of ancient Egypt were considered the world's best. The world's best. Even, say in the Middle Ages, if you ask for a doctor in Germany, they're likely to drill holes in your head to get the demons out. That might be their first step. If you want adequate medical care, you need to go to the Middle East. That's where good doctors will perform real medicine. Okay, a little brief parts of their history. I'll keep this part fairly brief. The pharaoh's power began to decline around 2180 BCE. That was the time of the Old Kingdom. During what's known as the Middle Kingdom, pharaohs began to regain control. But really the important things to know is that during this time you begin to see Egyptian artifacts all over the ancient world, as far as the Red Sea, as far as the Indus River, as far as Mesopotamia. But Egypt has the unfortunate geographical distinction, like Mesopotamia, of being right in the daggone middle of everything. They're right on the crossroads between three main continents. And so because of that, they get invaded all the time. So the first group that invades are called the Hyksos. And they ruled for a period of time.
Both men and women used creams and perfumes. These were prepared in the state perfume factory, which was often staffed and supervised by women.
The Egyptians wore cool, white linen clothes made from flax grown in the Nile Delta. We still don't know how they made such fine cloth. This was another industry in which women were widely employed.
Marriage was usually monogamous, and if there should be a divorce, the husband was obliged to maintain his ex-wife. Women had the right to inherit and manage their own property, appear in court as witnesses, or act for themselves before a judge. A few of them even ruled as pharaohs.
Hatshepsut was one of these pharaohs, and she wore the double crown and false beard of the supreme ruler on state occasions.
During her lifetime, there were 20 years of peace and prosperity in the land. Traders came from all over the known world to Egypt, and Hatshepsut bolstered the economy even further by sending out trading expeditions to other lands.
Hatshepsut diligently strengthened Egypt's defenses, and there's documented evidence that she led the army herself into Nubia to secure the southern borders of her kingdom.
Hatshepsut's mortuary temple is one of the gems of Egyptian architecture. She also erected a pair of great obelisks at Karnak.
The obelisk could have been erected this way. An embankment of mud bricks could have been built with a funnel down which the obelisk would descend. The obelisk would have been dragged up the slope by teams of men hauling on ropes until it began to overhang the funnel. It is now tipped face down onto the funnel, which is cleared of sand through the tunnels at the bottom. The sand level starts to fall and the obelisk descends. All that remains is to clear away the ramp, leaving the obelisk standing free. Still standing 3,500 years later.
There were other pharaohs who are well known to us today. Akhenaten, who believed in one god rather than the pantheon of gods that the Egyptians traditionally revered, and his beautiful wife Nefertiti.
Ramses II, the soldier pharaoh who's left his image in dozens of amazing colossal monuments.
And everyone's favorite, Tutankhamun, the boy king known the world over because of the dazzling treasures found in his tomb. By the time of Tutankhamun's reign, all the pharaohs were buried in hidden tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The tombs were decorated by craftsmen living in their own village, where they lived lives of comparative comfort and passed their skills on to members of their own families. These are paintings in the craftsmen's tombs.
Hieroglyphs, the written language of ancient Egypt, appears on tomb walls, monuments, and on thousands of pieces of papyrus. It was written with a brush and ink, or carved into stone. This writing first appeared about 5,000 years ago and started with pictographs, as did the Sumerian writing. It very quickly evolved into the hieroglyphs we know today.
They wrote on papyrus, made from the reed. Because the Egyptians could keep written records, they were able to record business transactions and trade agreements, something absolutely essential for the economy.
And as we know by now, one of the characteristics of a sophisticated culture. In fact, the Egyptian empire was run by Pharaoh's scribes, who collected the taxes and kept records of everything.
But Egyptian writing wasn't just used for business.
What? Senate nen senues nefer her nebu. Peter simis sebat chai.
She looks like a rising morning star, shining bright, fair of skin, lovely the look of her eyes, upright neck, shining breast, hair true lapis lazuli, arms surpassing gold, she causes all men's necks to turn about to see her.
In order to maintain the good life, the economy had to function in a stable society. 3,500 years ago, to ensure peace within her borders, Egypt had a powerful standing army. In time of war, extra draftees were rounded up in the countryside.
Pharaoh himself often commanded the troops. His generals were sometimes princes, but there was a corps of professional officers. Even though pharaohs tried to bolster the economy by invading other countries, the one sure way to keep the economy expanding was trade.